I'm a communications assistant here with Nautilus International. Recently, I attended a conference on trade union renewal held by Unions 21. Unions 21 is an organisation that connects 24 different unions, and it looks to help unions find new ways to move into the future and also to find new ways to deliver for members. At the conference, I attended all sorts of seminars around the use of AI, on strengthening member-led democracy, and crucially, on engaging young people within the trade union movement. The conference was a brilliant opportunity to talk to people from across the trade union movement and exchange ideas and experiences. And especially with new legislation coming in that repeals a lot of the previous limitations around industrial organising, especially, this was especially timely. With me here today is Becky Wright, who is the Executive Director of Unions 21. Becky has previously served as a director of the TUC's Organising Academy and has huge experience in supporting unions across all sorts of industries. Thank you so much for coming today, Becky.
Hi, Amy.
I think the first thing that a lot of people will be wondering, so what really is Unions 21 and what's it all about? How did it start?
So it started about 30 years ago, and originally it was a place for trade unions to think through how they're modern and to kind of advocate on behalf of unions in the then at the time new Labour government and kind of the surrounding kind of policy sort of world. In its current incarnation, Unions 21 leads the way in union best practice and innovation, and we work with unions to give them insight and help as they navigate the challenges and the complexities of today so they can build their unions for tomorrow. So in other words, what we do is we're a place for unions to both think about all the challenges they have, but also to kind of get real practical support and guidance to put any kind of changes in place.
So we've had 10 years of really quite destructive legislation. It hasn't been an easy time for trade unions. But something I'm wondering is going into the future with the new government, which seems a bit more friendly, and with the new legislation coming in, what do you think are going to be some of our biggest challenges?
I think the biggest challenges for unions across the piece, whether you're a union like Nautilus, which has got an international kind of, which is unique in its international kind of makeup and take up and stuff like that, is a perennial challenge for unions, which is how do you evolve and change to meet the needs of your members and potential members now and in the future. And yes, you know, in the UK at least we have a more union friendly government than we did before, but the challenge remains the same, right? Under the previous government in the UK, the union movement needed to think not only about how they respond to the legislation, but how they just keep up with the times as a membership organisation. That's not going to stop. It's not going to stop. And actually, in some respects, it's going to be even more of a challenge because we are going to have legislation which gives us rights to access workers that we weren't able to access before and to kind of be out there. And so we need to make sure that we have the capacity in order to take advantage of these new things. Under the Conservatives, we could kind of almost do a business as normal arrangement and kind of think, oh, the reason we're not doing so well is because of the Conservatives, and now we have this other government, and I think it's going to put even more pressure on us to really think like, oh my god, how easy is it for members to join? What's the kind of information they're getting? How do they get involved as being an activist? How do we train and support those activists? How do we make sure that our union reflects what our members think, feel and do? And even more now, how do we make sure that we win on what members really care about?
So I'm wondering, you're part of an organisation that connects 24 different trade unions. What examples of good practice have you seen? what do you think is some of the best ideas that are coming out right now?
So I think yeah, I mean we have 24 unions that are in what like membership, for want of a better term,
Mm,
of Unions 21, but we also work with unions across Europe, Australia and New Zealand to kind of look for all of these different, like, yeah, who's doing what when, what's
yeah.
really good. And there's something that I would say, which is that every union is doing something really well,
Hmm.
even if you don't see it on the surface, right? But what might work for one union might not work for another because of the
Definitely.
context, yeah, or because of kind of where they're at. What I would say is you've got unions like the National Education Union that has been really quick to think through like member engagement and digitalization and the use of AI within their union as an organization. That's
Mm,
way ahead than an awful lot of other unions. But you are seeing, for example, in unions like Australia, there's some unions over in America too, Denmark, where they're setting up like innovation hubs, which are about kind of trying new things to their, like, it's like an experimental portal, right? So they're trying to think, oh, what could we just try out and see what works for our members? And if it doesn't work, we won't do it. But if it does work, then we'll
yeah.
continue it and see how it goes. And I think these are the most interesting kind of things that are happening at the moment. But what I would also really like to highlight is a perennial like love is a bit of a strong word, but perennial thing of mine that I think is great, which is you have unions which like ASLEF, the train drivers union, which is sort of seen as fairly old fashioned, kind of
Yeah.
very kind of, we are what we are, we've always been like this, la 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 la. And yet they have incredible they get great wins for their members, right? And
Exactly. They're very
right,
effective.
they're very effective in what they do. And if you were to, we have a maturity model for unions at the moment that
Yeah.
unions have been taking part in, and a union like theirs would score off the chart for strengthening collective voice, because
Mm,
they have a real clear sense of, this is what we want to achieve as a union, and this is how we're going to achieve it in all of the different companies that we are recognised in. And that kind of what I'd call industrial discipline really works. You just kind
mm.
of need to be able to kind of do it. So I mean, lots of different bits of good practice, but those are the first two
Yeah.
that kind of come to mind.
I think here at Nautilus, one of the really interesting things we were talking about at the conference was about engaging young people
Yeah,
and also about unionizing new sectors. And here at Nautilus, we're kind of putting the two together because one of our fastest growing areas of membership is yacht workers,
yeah,
who are primarily younger, not always, but
yeah,
you do get a lot of young people going to work on yachts, and they face very, very specific challenges. And quite often, these challenges aren't particularly well understood. No thanks to certain TV shows, Below Deck. Yeah, don't mention it. But they really do face specific challenges, especially since we've left the EU. And at Nautilus, we've been following this very, very closely, and we've been quite specific in supporting our members on yachts because it is very different to a lot of the other sectors that we unionize. And
yeah,
I I sometimes wonder, it was really interesting when you talked about how young people are very, very open to joining a trade union by and large, if
mm,
the union is able to make a case for itself, argue why it's necessary, because we don't have a lot of young people, it's not part of when your vocabulary when you grow up, it's almost quite alien.
yeah.
So I suppose relating this to our example here at Nautilus, is what do you think is going on across other unions?
So I think your exact like discussion around super yachts is
Mm,
great, because I think the work that Nautilus is doing around that is to be commended and respected, because it's almost like all the things that make collective bargaining and organising really hard
Yeah.
is encapsulated within super yachts, right? Remote
Definitely.
workers, temporary
Yep.
contracts, private sector, not easy for the union to get hold of them, right? So all of these, young work, as you said, not primarily young workers, but still young workers, maybe migrant workers. I mean, literally every single box around that makes things difficult to organise, you've got that, and you could tick all of those boxes, right? So I think first off on the bat, I think it's worth commending Nautilus for this work and for trying to kind of do that. And I think when you were sort of asking me before about like best practice, I don't think this is just about best practice. I also think it's about unions sort of taking risks to do things that are a bit challenging as well. And if you'd asked me that question, I would have said 100% like Nautilus kind of doing that. And then as you raised the point around young workers, we've known for a while that young workers are open to unions if it is explained to them in a way that connects with their values and with what people kind of want. And this sort of go back right to your first question, like, well, very first question, one of your first questions, right, which is that this is a massive challenge for unions, which is how do you evolve, keeping true to values, keeping true to the reasons why you're there, but also kind of, you know, like dealing with the realities of the now and of the future, right? So if people are saying, oh, we think we can negotiate our pay better on our own than we can like as part of a collective, how do you explain that to people, and how do you kind of take them on that journey and kind of try and bring them, because nobody is born a trade unionist, right? Nobody is sort of like we all kind of come, especially those of us who don't come from a union family, right? We kind of find it and they're like, oh right, oh okay.
Quite often with trade unionism there's a lot of jargon. I remember sometimes trying to explain it to other young people, and you end up trying to avoid all this jargon that comes with it. And also the old sort of stereotype that tends to be more predominant around older people when they talk about the winter of discontent and things like that. But you know that still has an effect.
Yeah. I mean, it's so funny you talk about the winter of discontent. I mean, like, I wasn't born when the winter of discontent happened, right? Like, it's literally half a century ago.
Literally.
And yet people still talk about it in the media like it happened last week. And also within the trade union movement, I think we still think about it like it happened last week as well. And like a couple of years ago, I was being interviewed as part of like a radio panel, and they were sort of saying about, I think it was even the miners' strike or something like that, right? And I was like, I was 4 when the miners, like, I don't have any. I was 4. I'm from a working class London family who had no connections to anything related to this. This was not a discussion at our dinner table. I can tell you that now. And the other panelists just sort of looked at me, and I was like, but for most of us, actually now that reference is something that does not make any sense whatsoever. And the language we use as within the trade union world as well is, you know, of another time. And there's some things to be said about some of the words we use and why we use them, and how we've sort of come together. But I also think it's like anything, it can be exclusionary, and it can also kind of stop people from really kind of understanding like what, you know, like what the value is to them. I think there's something to be said as well about looking at young people like they're one big group. It really drives me nuts. Like, you know, it like the young, I remember when I was a young trade unionist, right? And like, and the
it
young
can often
people
feel a little patronizing.
What do the young people want? And I think someone once said to me, you never ask a group of young trade unionists how to approach young people, because they don't know either, because
we're all different.
because we're all different, and also we're already, what would work for us will definitely not work for people that have never heard of trade unions before, right? So if it makes us feel warm and fuzzy, the chances are it's not going to have the same effect for people who've got no idea about unions.
Yeah.
But this idea that, I mean, obviously we can see generational differences in terms of people's experiences within the labour market and within the broader kind of societal market, being able to afford your own house, and whether that's through rent or mortgage, whatever that looks like, right? All of these challenges can be generational, but they also can apply across the generations. I think what's more interesting is to think about what is it that affects young people in your sector and in your
Yeah,
industry, and
exactly.
talk to that, not talk to young people as a
Yes.
whole.
I think that's where smaller unions like Nautilus perhaps have a bit of an easier time, because with yacht workers and
Yeah,
cadets, join the Merchant Navy, you need to go through a cadetship.
yeah,
And you do get a few older cadets actually, but by and large cadets are usually
yeah,
younger people.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah, yeah,
there are huge issues that cadets are facing right now with the amount of support, financial support they're getting is completely inadequate. There's a real lack of regulation around the trading and how it's provided. And also female cadets have a very high dropout rate due to issues around harassment quite often.
yeah,
So by honing in on those very specific issues and working to address those very specific issues, we at Nautilus are able to deliver for our members, number one, and actively addressing those issues rather than saying, oh, you're young people, so you must think this and this. And I think for the more general unions, that can be quite difficult, because there is such a such a range. Well, we we represent some quite specific workers.
yeah, yeah. It's definitely one of the things that I think is really interesting. There was a period of time where unions contracted into these kind of generalist unions, right? And we
Mm,
did it for numerous reasons, like not just falling membership, but actually more like our pensions weren't working properly, right? So
yeah.
the number one reason why unions merged is because staff pensions were
Hmm.
unaffordable and people needed to do it. But also,
Yeah.
also falling membership and falling income and mismanagement and stuff like that. Um, but what we've definitely seen over the last few years is that the more general a union is, the harder it is to articulate a message of who you are and who you're for.
Hmm.
And so specialist unions, professional unions like Nautilus have a much greater opportunity to recruit and retain members and to represent their members properly, because they're literally exactly who they're for, right? Nobody else. So all the conversations at work are about the type of members that you've got. It's not like, oh, well, if we do this for this group, we have to do it for this group. It's like, no, this
Yeah.
is our members and this is where they're at. And I also think it can create as a closeness to membership where you actually do know what people are thinking, because sometimes you can even go, yeah, well, that'll be Bob will have something to say about that, right? It's a unique environment to be in a union like Nautilus, and to be able to
Yeah.
be as like close to members.
What it also does is, when I was talking about that level of jargon, that, oh, you
Yeah,
need to go to this committee, then this committee, it removes that, because it becomes very immediate. Because we have a small field of issues, well, a very large field of issues in fairness, but we are interested in one sector, we're able to hone in quite effectively. But one of the really interesting sessions I went to was on the Games Union, which is part of I believe, the Financial Services Union,
that's right. Yeah,
which is, I thought, was a really interesting example of how a larger union was able to engage a sector that wasn't unionized before
mm,
by giving them a very clear voice, giving them a certain level of autonomy. And this was in Ireland, I believe.
Yeah.
But have you seen a similar thing going on in the UK?
So there were a few small scale. Well, there weren't. I don't think the union will say in terms of the money that was invested in small
Mm,
scale, but you had unions like Prospect tried that with the special effects workers and also with Sky in the as part of their Back2 sector, and you also saw the CW in the UK do something fairly similar to the FSU, but we don't have a lot of unions having what I'd call sub brands, right,
mm,
as part of their kind of union makeup. It's not something that unions have sort of really adapted, and I think this would be a really interesting piece of work for unions to explore, right?
yeah.
You know, if you're going into an adjacent sector to you that's not quite like who you have at the moment, why saddle, like, don't necessarily try and make everybody come into your union. Why don't you just think about what a union would be like for them and have them as
Mm,
like an affiliate, like a sub brand?
yeah.
um you know, and then people feel like it's to you. I mean, a long time ago I worked for a union, and the general secretary had a very clear vision of the sector that we were in, but also how the unions within the sector could relate to each other going forward. And I think it was one of the most interesting pieces of work, because he was like, I think a federated structure is the best. So if you think about how Nautilus is, right, where
Mm,
you've got your, you know, your different branches and you come together internationally, something like that, right? But within a sector where every different job within that sector could be represented by its own union, but ultimately people all kind of helped and shared each other, so there was a lot of change. There's not met so that was a very long answer to a what could have been a very short answer, but not as much, and I think we need to do
mm.
more.
No, I found it incredibly interesting. And I suppose the only example I could think of was perhaps Unite Hospitality, which
Yeah.
is quite an interesting example. Also, a sector that is incredibly hard to unionize. One of my final questions is, we've already talked about the challenges that we're going to be facing, especially even though this new legislation makes it a lot easier for us, it means that we no longer have the excuse that the Tories have been making things very difficult. What role do you think unions can now play in advocating for their members to this new government? Do you think what signs and signals are you seeing?
So I think that there is a lot of, let's just even think about the Nautilus rather than unions in general. But if I just think about Nautilus as a
Yeah.
union itself, right? You know, you've within opposition, the union built really good relationships with the shadow shipping minister,
Mm,
and those are the sorts of relationships that have gone into government that, you know, I know that that minister thinks very highly of the union and really kind of, you know, values the insight and voice that the union, you know, when it speaks on behalf of maritime workers, professional maritime workers. So that is a massive opportunity for the union to kind of you know, to think through. But also what we're seeing is a willingness within government to recreate and to reconstitute things like industrial strategy. And
yeah.
while maritime isn't one of the areas that's been kind of earmarked for a council and all of the kind of discussions that unions will be at the table talking through the issues around developing industry, I think there is still a place where you've got good relationships with employers
Mm,
through maritime. You get, you know, those are the sorts of things that you'll have a bit more space to
mm,
influence and a bit more space to kind of think through. You know, the door won't be closed as
mm.
much, I think, as what it has been.
I think it's been heartening to see the recognition of the P&O scandal
Yeah.
and how absolutely disgraceful it was. But not only are ministers now saying, oh, that was disgraceful, but there is now legislation being passed to prevent something like that from happening ever
Yeah.
again. So
Yeah.
I think these are positive signs, and I am looking towards a very bright future for Nautilus and the rest of the trade union movement.
No reason why not.
Thank you so, so much, Becky. It was brilliant having you.
No, thank you so much for the invitation, Amy, and thank you to all Nautilus colleagues who've watched.